In 2026, a federal court ruling brought renewed attention to one of Kentucky's most controversial criminal cases. Jeffrey Clark, who had once been convicted in connection with the 1992 death of Rhonda Sue Warford, was awarded $24 million in compensation after spending 22 years behind bars for a crime he has always maintained he did not commit. But this was not simply a story about a financial settlement. It was a story about a life changed by a wrongful conviction, decades that could never be recovered, and a question that has remained unanswered for more than 30 years. In 1992, Rhonda Sue Warford, a 19-year-old woman from Kentucky, was found dead in a case that shocked the local community. As pressure grew to find those responsible, the investigation moved toward a highly controversial direction. A theory involving a supposed satanic ritual began to emerge. Jeffrey Clark and Keith Hardin became the focus of the investigation. They were accused of being connected to Rhonda's death, even though years later, serious questions began to surface regarding how evidence had been collected, interpreted, and presented. Defense attorneys argued that the investigation had been influenced by public fear and assumptions, that important possibilities were overlooked, and that two men had been forced to pay the price for a crime they did not commit. For more than 2 decades, Clark and Hardin lived with the weight of their convictions, while Rhonda's family continued searching for the truth about who was truly responsible for taking her life. Then, in 2018, the case reached a major turning point. The convictions against both men were overturned, and they were released from prison. But freedom could not erase the years that had already been taken from them. The later $24 million compensation ruling became another significant milestone, bringing the total financial resolution connected to the case to $44 million. Yet behind that enormous figure, one question remains unanswered. If Jeffrey Clark and Keith Hardin were not responsible for Rhonda Sue Warford's death, then who truly was? And why, after more than 3 decades, does Rhonda's family still not have the final answer they have been waiting for? If you are interested in cold cases, forgotten investigations, and the search for truth behind controversial convictions, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future stories. Every case is a reminder that the truth may be hidden for years, but it is always worth pursuing. Rhonda Sue Warford was born in 1972 inches in the state of Kentucky, United States. In 1992, when she turned 19, she was at the beginning of adulthood, a time when many young people begin forming their own relationships and shaping the direction of their future. Those who knew Rhonda described her as an ordinary young woman who was close to her family and friends. She had meaningful relationships, people who cared about her life, and like many young women her age, Rhonda had her own hopes and plans for the years ahead. She lived in the Louisville area of Kentucky, where communities at the time were often closely connected. It was an environment where people knew one another, paid attention to changes around them, and could quickly notice when something unusual occurred. Before the tragedy unfolded, there were no signs that Rhonda was facing any serious threat. There was no information suggesting that she was involved in dangerous activities or relationships that could have led to a devastating outcome. To her family and the people who loved her, Rhonda was simply a 19-year-old young woman trying to enjoy the early years of her life. She still had many experiences ahead of her, many plans she had not yet fulfilled, and a future she would never have the chance to reach. But in 1992, that ordinary life was shattered by an event that would leave Rhonda's family searching for answers for many years to come. Before April 1992, Rhonda Sue Warford's life was similar to that of many other young people living in Kentucky at the time. She was not someone who sought attention, nor were there any signs that she was entering a dangerous situation. To her family and friends, Rhonda was a young woman enjoying the early years of adulthood. She spent time with people close to her, maintained her relationships, and lived a relatively ordinary life. The days before the tragedy contained no indication that she would become the victim of a case that would remain controversial for decades. Like many people her age, Rhonda still had many things ahead of her. She had her own interests, important people in her life, and experiences she had not yet had the chance to complete. To those who loved her, she was not simply a name in an investigative file, but a 19-year-old young woman whose presence was a familiar part of their everyday lives. However, the early 1990s was also a unique period in American society. Many communities began to express concerns about secretive groups and activities believed to be connected to cults. Stories about satanic cults appeared frequently in the media, creating an atmosphere of fear and influencing the way the public viewed certain criminal cases. When Rhonda disappeared and the investigation began, these fears gradually became part of the narrative surrounding the case. Several theories emerged, but not all of them were supported by reliable scientific evidence. And it was within this atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that the investigation into Rhonda's death began to move in a more complicated direction, leading to controversies that would continue for many years afterward. The 2nd of April, 1992. It was a day that appeared completely ordinary for Rhonda Sue Warford. She left her home in Kentucky, with no one in her family knowing that it would be the last time they would ever see her alive. The details surrounding Rhonda's final journey that day remain filled with unanswered questions. Investigators who later examined the case were unable to fully reconstruct every step she took, or determine exactly what happened during the final hours before she disappeared. At first, Rhonda's absence may have seemed like nothing more than her being somewhere else and expected to return soon. But as time continued to pass without any phone calls, messages, or signs of contact from her, concern within the family began to grow. For those who knew Rhonda, what caused the greatest worry was not only that she had not returned, but the complete silence that followed. A young woman who had been living an ordinary life had suddenly disappeared without any explanation. Her family began searching for information about Rhonda, contacting anyone who might know where she was and trying to piece together the final details of the day she vanished. The more they searched, the more they realized this was not a normal situation of someone simply leaving home. Something unusual had happened, and that feeling became the beginning of an investigation that would continue for years, surrounded by countless unanswered questions. However, as investigators began following Rhonda's trail, they quickly discovered that the case was far more complicated than an ordinary missing person investigation. After Rhonda Sue Warford disappeared, investigators believed that she had been taken to a remote area in Meade County, Kentucky, where her body was later discovered. However, the most critical period in the case, what happened between the moment Rhonda left home and the time of her death, remained an unanswered gap. No direct witnesses came forward to describe the complete sequence of events leading to Rhonda's final moments. Investigators could only rely on the evidence left behind at the scene, statements collected during the investigation, and theories developed as they attempted to understand what had happened. During the early stages, the case quickly attracted public attention when rumors emerged about possible involvement with cult groups. The social climate in the United States during the early 1990s also contributed to the widespread attention surrounding stories of satanic cults in several high-profile criminal cases. During later prosecution proceedings, prosecutors presented a theory that Rhonda's death may have been connected to a satanic ritual. This argument strongly influenced the way the public viewed the case and became a significant part of the narrative used against those considered suspects. However, over time, this theory began to face increasing scrutiny. Legal researchers and those who later reviewed the case argued that there was no strong scientific evidence proving that Rhonda had been the victim of a satanic ritual. Many details that were once considered important during the investigation were later questioned regarding their accuracy and reliability. The one thing that remained certain was that Rhonda Sue Warford had been murdered. But after many years passed, the identity of the person truly responsible for her death remained unknown. And as the investigation continued to expand, the attention of law enforcement gradually shifted toward individuals suspected of being connected to the case, beginning the most controversial chapter in the entire investigation. After days of searching with no answers, Rhonda Sue Warford's family was finally forced to face the most painful truth. Her body was discovered in a remote area of Meade County, Kentucky, ending the hope that the 19-year-old could still somehow return home. The discovery completely changed the direction of the case. What had begun as a missing person investigation officially became a homicide investigation, where the focus was no longer only on finding Rhonda, but on identifying the person responsible for her death. For Rhonda's family, it was a devastating moment beyond words. Before that, they were still holding on to the possibility of receiving a phone call, hearing new information, or believing that she might one day appear again. Instead, they were forced to accept that the young woman they loved would never come home. Shortly after the discovery of her body, law enforcement officers arrived at the scene. The surrounding area was secured to prevent contamination and to protect any evidence that could help uncover the truth. Investigators began documenting every detail of the location where Rhonda was found. Every piece of evidence, every remaining trace, had the potential to become an important part of reconstructing what happened before her death. However, the scene did not immediately provide clear answers. Instead, it opened the door to an investigation that would continue for years, where the truth would become surrounded by uncertainty, controversial theories, and a legal battle that followed. From the very first hours, the area where Rhonda Sue Warford's body was discovered was placed under strict control by law enforcement to support the investigation. Detectives secured the scene and restricted access to authorized personnel in order to preserve any evidence that may have remained. At the location, the investigation team began documenting every detail connected to the case. They photographed the scene, prepared official reports, examined the position of Rhonda's body, and collected any evidence that could help reconstruct what had happened before her death. Physical evidence was carefully searched for, including items that may have belonged to the victim, signs of a struggle, or indications that another person had been present at the scene. Every small detail was considered a potential piece of the larger picture that investigators were trying to assemble. However, the case occurred in 1992, at a time when forensic science did not yet have the powerful tools available today. DNA analysis technology was not widely used in criminal investigations, limiting the ability of investigators to fully examine biological evidence. The evidence collected at the scene confirmed that Rhonda had been the victim of a homicide, but it was not enough to identify the person responsible. There was no single piece of evidence that could provide a breakthrough and lead investigators directly to a specific suspect. At the same time, forensic specialists conducted an autopsy to determine the cause of Rhonda's death. The results confirmed that she had been murdered, with findings indicating that she had suffered a serious attack before her death. However, the examination did not provide complete answers for the investigation. The weapon used in the crime could not be conclusively identified, and there was no strong DNA sample available to directly connect Rhonda's death to a specific suspect. The limitations of forensic technology at the time left many important questions unanswered. Who had taken Rhonda to this location? What had happened during the final hours of her life? And who was responsible for the tragedy that took her away? The case entered a difficult stage, as investigators were forced to search for answers through incomplete evidence and theories that remained highly disputed. In the days following the discovery of Rhonda Sue Warford's death, investigators explored multiple possible leads in an effort to determine what had happened and identify the person responsible for the death of the 19-year-old woman. Detectives collected statements from individuals connected to the case, examined Rhonda's personal relationships, and reviewed information circulating within the local community. However, in the social climate of the early 1990s, one of the most controversial investigative directions focused on the theory that the crime may have been connected to alleged satanic activities. Rumors involving cults quickly spread and influenced the way many people viewed the case. Several individuals became subjects of attention based on personal relationships, witness statements, or information that had not been fully verified. Rather than relying solely on physical evidence, the investigation gradually became influenced by theories surrounding the lifestyles, beliefs, and social connections of those who were considered suspects. This caused the direction of the case to become increasingly complicated over the years that followed. Eventually, police attention focused on two young men from Kentucky, Jeffrey Dwayne Clark and Gar Keith Harden. Investigators believed the two men were connected to Rhonda's death and began building a case intended to bring them before the legal system. However, the accusations against Clark and Harden later became the center of significant debate. Questions surrounding the evidence, witness statements, and the methods used by authorities to build the case were examined again in the years that followed. At that time, Rhonda's family wanted only one thing: to discover the truth about what had happened to her. But the path toward finding answers led to a lengthy legal battle, where the line between justice and investigative error became the central question. In 1992, the investigation into the death of Rhonda Sue Warford entered a new phase when authorities decided to arrest two men believed to be connected to the case, Jeffrey Dwayne Clark and Gar Keith Harden. At the time, investigators believed that Clark and Harden were linked to circumstances they suspected were connected to Rhonda's death. A significant part of the prosecution's theory was based on the possibility that the crime was connected to activities involving satanic beliefs, an investigative direction that had attracted considerable attention throughout Kentucky in the early 1990s. Based on witness statements, social relationships, and information gathered during the investigation, police believed that these two men could have been responsible for Rhonda's death. Their arrests were viewed as a major development after months of searching for answers on behalf of the victim's family. However, the case quickly became one of the most controversial investigations in Kentucky. The allegations involving satanic activity later came under serious scrutiny, as many details lacked sufficient scientific evidence to support them. The greatest weakness in the investigation was the absence of direct physical evidence linking Clark or Harden to the crime scene. There was no strong DNA evidence, no confirmed murder weapon, and no clear scientific proof showing that they were the individuals responsible for Rhonda's death. Despite this, both men still faced a lengthy legal process, as the original accusations became the foundation of a case that would later be reviewed multiple times. For Rhonda's family, the arrests initially brought hope that justice had finally arrived. But behind those accusations remained one important question: Were the men who were convicted truly the ones responsible for the tragedy that occurred in 1992? During the investigation, Jeffrey Dwayne Clark and Gar Keith Hardin became the central focus of police questioning. Investigators attempted to clarify the connection between the two men and Rhonda Sue Warford, as well as determine what may have happened in the period leading up to her death. However, both Clark and Hardin denied any involvement in Rhonda's killing. They did not admit to taking part in any actions that led to the tragedy in Meade County, Kentucky. Investigators continued to rely heavily on statements collected while building the case. Some of these statements were considered important by prosecutors at the time, but they later became a source of debate regarding their accuracy and reliability. Much of the information used to strengthen suspicion against Clark and Hardin did not come directly from physical evidence found at the crime scene. Instead, it was based on witness accounts, personal relationships, and theories developed throughout the investigation. The greatest challenge in the case was the lack of scientific evidence that could clearly identify who was responsible for Rhonda's death. The remaining evidence from the scene was not strong enough to establish a direct connection between the two accused men and the murder. In addition, some investigative theories were built around assumptions rather than confirmed facts. This made the search for the truth more complicated and created significant controversy in the years that followed. Although Clark and Hardin continued to maintain their innocence, the case moved forward toward prosecution based on the information authorities believed could demonstrate their involvement. But as the evidence was examined again over time, questions about the accuracy and reliability of the original investigation began to emerge. Those doubts would later become a major factor in a legal battle that continued for more than 2 decades. The case against Jeffrey Dwayne Clark and Gar Keith Hardin was built primarily on witness statements, investigative theories, and the prosecution's interpretation of the circumstances surrounding Rhonda Sue Warford's death. One of the most important elements of the prosecution's argument was testimony provided by several witnesses. These individuals offered information that was believed to connect Clark and Hardin to Rhonda and to events that occurred before her death. However, the accuracy of these statements later became a major point of dispute. Some of the information presented was not based on direct observation of the crime, but instead came from conversations, assumptions, or details that had been passed from one person to another. Alongside witness testimony, the theory involving satanic activity became a prominent part of the prosecution's case. During the early 1990s, fears surrounding alleged cult activity were spreading across parts of the United States, and the Rhonda Warford case became connected to that wider social atmosphere. Prosecutors argued that elements related to satanic beliefs could help explain a possible motive for the murder. However, years later, legal experts and defense attorneys argued that this direction caused the investigation to become influenced by unproven assumptions rather than focusing entirely on scientific evidence. From a legal perspective, the prosecution's case faced a significant challenge: the lack of direct physical evidence. There was no strong DNA evidence proving that Clark or Hardin had been present at the crime scene. No murder weapon was conclusively identified as belonging to either accused man. The remaining physical evidence did not establish a clear connection between them and Rhonda's death. When the case was reviewed in later years, attorneys representing Clark and Hardin argued that many parts of the prosecution's case relied on information that had not been fully verified. They claimed that the original investigation had been influenced by early assumptions and theories that developed before sufficient evidence was available. These weaknesses became a central part of the appeal process, leading to a long-running debate over whether the two men were truly responsible for Rhonda's death, or whether they had become caught in an investigation that had taken the wrong direction. As the case entered a new legal phase, questions surrounding the evidence and the fairness of the original trial became increasingly difficult to ignore. In 1995, Jeffrey Dwayne Clark and Gar Keith Hardin officially faced trial in connection with the death of Rhonda Sue Warford. During the proceedings, prosecutors argued that the two men were responsible for the murder of the 19-year-old woman. The prosecution focused on witness testimony, investigative details, and the theory that Rhonda's death was connected to activities suspected of involving satanic beliefs. Before the jury, prosecutors argued that the information gathered throughout the investigation was sufficient to prove Clark and Hardin's responsibility for the crime. The evidence and arguments presented during the trial convinced the jury that the two defendants were the individuals behind Rhonda's death. As a result, both Jeffrey Clark and Gar Keith Hardin were found guilty and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. However, as the years passed, the case became surrounded by increasing controversy. Defense attorneys argued that the original convictions relied too heavily on disputed testimony and theories that were never supported by direct scientific evidence. Both men continued to maintain their innocence throughout their years of imprisonment. They pursued legal efforts seeking a review of the case, while concerns about the original investigation continued to attract attention. More than 2 decades after the 1995 trial, issues surrounding the reliability of the evidence and the way the investigation had been handled became the foundation for attempts to overturn the original convictions. The lengthy legal battle eventually led to a major turning point, as the questions surrounding the truth behind Rhonda Sue Warford's death were brought back into examination. More than 22 years is an incredibly long time for someone to spend behind bars under a conviction that would later be shown to contain serious flaws. The youth of Jeffrey Clark and Gar Keith Hardin passed inside prison walls, while the biggest questions surrounding the Rhonda Sue Warford case remained unanswered. For Rhonda's family, the pain came not only from losing a 19-year-old young woman with an entire future ahead of her, but also from having to wait decades for justice. Her loved ones lived through years of uncertainty, carrying the same question that never disappeared: who was truly responsible for taking away the life of Rhonda Sue Warford? This case became a painful reminder that justice cannot be built on fear, rumors, or unproven theories. An investigation only has meaning when the pursuit of truth stands above public pressure and the assumptions of a particular era. The 2 men who were once convicted were eventually released, but their freedom could never restore the years they had lost. At the same time, Rhonda's family continued waiting for the person truly responsible for her death to be brought to justice. More than 3 decades have passed since Rhonda Sue Warford disappeared, yet her story remains as a powerful lesson about the responsibility of the justice system, the importance of scientific evidence, and the need to continue searching for the truth. Because in every unsolved case, the greatest purpose is not simply finding a name. It is about restoring justice for the person who was lost and providing the answers that their loved ones have waited a lifetime to receive.